I'm not this guy. This is not me. Like sometimes people get confused. Matt Ruwe, not Matt Ruwe. But yes, don't know too much about football really. But I do know about software. I've been a software developer in Omaha here for 25 years, a little bit more. And in that time, I've worked in a whole bunch of different industries. I've worked here at Farm Credit. I spent about 5 of those 25 years here, 10 during my consulting days, and can vouch for the fact that Farm Credit's a great place to work. They treat you really well. It's obviously a very nice facility, and it's very much team environment. So I would recommend anybody checking it out. So. Yeah, these are the industries that I've had the opportunity to work in: banking, agribusiness. Built a niche ERP solution for the janitorial security guard industry, which I had no idea was a thing. E-commerce, did that for a little bit. Genetics, worked at Pioneer over in Des Moines for about 6 months and built a genetic solution for them. And healthcare, real estate, and construction now. So right now I'm at Kiewit, but the thing that I've learned, having gone through all of that, is that software is really a great place to be. Technology in general is a great place to be. Azure, cloud, whatever you want to do. Every business in the whole country, the whole world needs some form of technology to help their business run more efficiently. So I think we're all in a great place. I think there's lots to learn. There's lots to do, and I would encourage you, if you have a passion for anything in the technology space, to reach out to Vaibhav and ask him if you can present it as his user group. I'm going to treat this as a very informal kind of presentation. I don't have like every word written down that I'm going to say. I'm making up most of it. It's based on my experience. I've got a bunch of notes and some slides here to run through. But I would appreciate any questions that you have, or if you feel like I'm breezing over topics that you want to dig into deeper, let's do that. I don't think I have an hour's worth of content here, so we should be good with some questions. And I would welcome you to do that. So right now I'm a software architect at Kiewit. I get the privilege of working in their Center of Excellence, their Software Development Center of Excellence. I lead that, which means I get to work with all the software developers that work for Kiewit. And that includes people in Canada, the United States, and Mexico. So I get to help them build better software wherever they are. And there's lots of different kinds of software being built. One of my directives is to find software developers inside of Kiewit, because they kind of like hide in corners, and they're sometimes afraid to come out and say, I'm here because we're gonna stomp them out with a whole bunch of processes. But we don't want to do that. We want to be nice and go about that. So if you're interested in that, I can talk more about it. But I really enjoy working for Kiewit as much as I did for Farm Credit. So, and then again, I've led the .NET user group here in Omaha for about 15 years. That's been a real privilege for me to be a part of. It was career changing to get that put on my lap back in 2008. That was kind of a big deal. I didn't realize at the time that it was going to be as big a deal as it was. It really helped shape me into feeling comfortable doing this sort of stuff. So I would encourage you to maybe that you don't have to lead a user group, but speaking about what you're passionate about would be something that would be beneficial for everybody here. So these are the technologies that I work with. I just kind of try to break them down into 3 different categories: things I worked with a lot, things I'm comfortable with, and things I'm trying to learn more about. There's more to this list, but these are like the things that came top of mind. So do a lot with software architecture. I help our developers build software that's maintainable, scalable, testable, all those abilities that you run into with software development. Those are key to what I do. I've done a ton with .NET. Obviously, I run the user group here in town, so I've had quite a bit of experience doing a variety of things on that stack. Spent some time in Azure. I'm not an expert in Azure, but I've worked with it enough that I feel like I can talk about everything. I don't know about everything. Like if you ask me how an event hub works, I'll say I can tell you what it's for, but I don't know how it works. And then Azure DevOps, I own Azure DevOps at Kiewit, so anybody that wants to work with that platform, they're probably working with me on that. And then regular expressions. Who's familiar with regular expressions? Okay, who likes them? Yeah, I do. I think they're awesome. So anytime that anybody has a problem at Kiewit or anywhere I work with regular expressions, if you guys have problems with regular expressions, let me know. I'd love to help you out. I think they're fun. It's sort of my thing. Back in 2006, that's all I did for about 6 months. And at first I hated them, and then I kind of came to love them. I've done quite a bit with PowerShell as well. So a lot of different things in that platform, and I enjoyed it. Azure AD, which we're going to talk about tonight, I have some experience with that. I feel like I've been on this journey for the past 10 years, learning about OAuth and how it works and what it is. And man, it is, I don't know, yeah, there's probably some people out there that just, get it. I'm not one of those folks. And so I'm coming to you tonight as like trying to learn this for the past 10 years. I feel like just in the last 6 months, I feel like I plateaued it, to the point where I think I know what I'm talking about, and I can probably share it with you. There's going to be a lot that I don't know, and if I glaze over something in Azure DevOps, Azure AD, I would love for you to stop me and we can dig in. And I may or may not know the answer. If somebody in the audience knows the answer, I'm sure there's some Azure experts out there. Feel free to jump in. GitHub and Linux are things I'm reasonably comfortable with, and then things I'm trying to learn more about. I'm not a front-end developer, but I feel like I should know more, and so I'm really trying to dig deep into React and learn more about that. A lot of our developers at Kiewit do Python development, which is important for me to get in front of and help them be better at their jobs. I'm trying to learn more about that, containers and Docker. This is kind of, again, I've been working with this for quite a while, but never really felt like I got to the point where I was good at it, and maybe I'm getting there. We'll see. And then I don't know if you guys have heard of Dapper, the Distributed Application Runtime. This is something that I know a little bit about. I'll do a presentation at the .NET User Group at some point here in the future about this, but if you don't know what it is, look it up. So those are kind of things that I've been doing. So what are we going to talk about tonight? The core of the presentation is Azure AD, also known as Entra ID, which is Microsoft is in the process of rebranding it. So you'll see Entra in some places and Azure AD in some places, and you'll see it in parentheses some places, or formerly known as, all over the place. So I don't know when the official cutover date is, but I think for now it's still Azure AD. But shortly will become Entra ID. Yeah.
So they're changing the name to Entra ID?
They're changing the name to Entra ID. Yeah.
I think it's supposed to go by September.
Yeah. So coming up very shortly, that will be in effect. It kind of makes sense because Microsoft Azure AD is not Active Directory. I mean, it has to do with identity, but it's very different from on-prem Active Directory. Active Directory on-prem is LDAP and Kerberos, and they have forests, and you have domain controllers and all this stuff. But Azure Active Directory doesn't have any of that. I have a slide in here that kind of shows you how it fits in the big picture of the Active Directory ecosystem, but it's just kind of a small part of it. So we'll talk about some supporting libraries for that. I'm going to run through a demo of one of the more complicated ways that you can use Entra ID to secure your web applications, and then we'll talk about some other considerations at the end. And again, interrupt me if you have questions or stop me. So yeah. So one thing we're not going to talk about tonight is authorization. Authorization is a bigger topic than even Entra ID can cover, Azure AD. They would say we have a story for authorization in AD, but they don't. I mean, it's not. It's a very simplistic model. You can do some good stuff with it, but it is limited, and there are better frameworks out there. So if you have something simple to do with it, or maybe mid-range, or if you're willing to really dig in and kind of apply your own effort to it, it could be a platform that supports that. But I would probably recommend using a different platform. And I can't recommend any at this point because I haven't done the research, but they do exist. So yeah, we're going to be treating it more like an authentication framework tonight. So This is the abstract for the OAuth 2 protocol. We'll just start by digging into that. The history of OAuth is actually pretty interesting. I'll try to remember to post a video. The guy that originally built OAuth 1 and then was involved in the OAuth 2 standard kind of like rage quit at one point, and his description of the thing is pretty entertaining. But yeah, go ahead and check this out. This is the RFC right here for OAuth. So it's double-sided, but it's, not huge, not a lot to it. If you want to read it, if you're bored during the presentation, come up and grab it. But it describes how OAuth should work. It does not describe an implementation for it. That's what all these providers do, like Entra ID and Auth0 and Okta. They all provide an implementation for OAuth. And then there's a bunch of libraries that you can use. We're gonna talk about that. So, but it basically just describes a way that you can exchange credentials without exposing the details of that. And so we'll talk about some of the ways that works. So the basic operation for OAuth looks like this, and this is abstract. This doesn't describe one of the flows, which we're going to talk about here in a little bit, but this is the basic way that OAuth operates and the 4 different things that are involved. And so my mouse is going to work. There it is. So this is the user. The resource owner is the person that knows or has the information that we're trying to access is for, right? And so they're the ones that can authorize people or authorize another service to access information on their behalf. The client application is your web app. This is maybe your API or your React application or your Razor Pages app. The thing that is going to try and access information on behalf of this user. The resource server is the thing that has access to that information but needs to protect it on behalf of that user. And so this is the thing that people are trying to hack, this resource server, because it has the information in there that somebody who's not authorized to access it might want. And so it's responsible for protecting it. And then the authorization server is the thing that can verify who the user is. That's where you type in your password. And so historically, you would run into websites where you, I can't think of a good example, but there are websites out there where you type your username and password into that website, right? And there's a lot of them, even today. But that's really not the most secure or even best way to approach it. I much prefer to authenticate with my Microsoft account or my Google account or Facebook, Twitter, whatever. Any of those are going to be better options to authenticate with than using somebody else's service, because when you put your password into their service, you're trusting them to keep your password safe, and they may or may not do a good job of that. There's lots of things that you should be aware of when you're storing passwords and secrets in general, and a lot of people don't do it well. Now the big companies, like I just mentioned, they're almost obligated to do it well because there's so many users on their systems, and they're very prone to attack, and so they're going to do a better job. So I want to put my password, my secrets into their systems, and not into third-party systems that I'm just kind of fly by the night things. And then I would caveat that by saying you should never use the same password in 2 different services, right? We're not doing that. I know we all do it, but we shouldn't do it, right? Okay, any questions on this? Does that make sense? Yeah.
So, speaking of the long learning curve for OAuth, right? Because the concepts have thrown me over the years. And one of the hard ones I've always had wrapping my mind around, which was an epiphany for me, is the whole resource owner view versus the resource server. Now, if it's Facebook is your resource server, then yes, it's my content on Facebook, and I own that. And so the consents, like so-and-so wants to access your Facebook posts or something, on your wall. That makes sense. But when you're in a business setting like at Kiewit, and it's a back-end system about construction, that's not my information. Yet when I'm logging in, I'm somehow the resource owner. So the terminology is not a, it's a weird fit. It's like it was oriented for a different scenario than how it's being used.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And then that bears itself out in Azure AD or Entra in the admin consent. The fact that if you don't have an admin consent on an application and I log in, it's going to ask me, oh, this wants your consent to access your company's information, which is like backwards. And so it's like, that's why it takes an admin to grant that consent. So that users aren't prompted with this totally unexpected consent.
Right, because they don't know what it's for. It's like, what? I don't know the construction details or the loan details for this user. That's
right.
That's
if
their
I say
information,
yes to
right?
this, am I somehow opening a security hole? It's just, so the whole thing is awkward. And I think when you get that understanding of what this whole scenario and how it's sort of shoehorned into using it for business, I think that helps with the understanding of applying the law too for business.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. So many places that terminology can really trip you up. I know just another totally unrelated example of that would be GitHub's pull request, right? I'm like, when I first heard a pull request, I'm like, what the heck is a pull request? Why would I request a pull? I want to push my code to you, right? But when you think about it from a distributed source control system and maybe an open source system where you have hugely diverse source repositories, it makes sense, but very few people actually use it that way. Words mess all things up. So understanding what they mean is really important. Does that make sense to everybody? Do you get what's going on here? Okay. If you don't, let me know. And then you can kind of see the interactions here, like resource owners talk to clients. Let me point. Resource owners talk to clients. This is like your web page right up here. In order to log in, you talk to the authorization server. The client application talks to the resource server to get the data on your behalf. And then depending what kind of flows you're using, the client application might also be asking for a token from the authorization server. There's also a token server, which is probably the more likely place that this would get called, but this is a simplification. Okay. Yeah, and this is abstract, right? Don't try to like shoehorn this into OAuth because you'll fall down. There's more details. We're going to get into it. Oh man, I messed up the I was going to put an animation here, but I messed that up. So let's just move that down for now, and we'll bring it back here in a sec. So these are the actors: client, resource owner, resource server, authorization server. We talked about these things. Let me just breeze through this, make sure I covered everything. I think I'll just jump into the example. Like the example here would be Walgreens. Like you have some photos that you want to print at Walgreens, but your photos are in your Google Photo folder, right? And so when you go to Walgreens to have them print your photos, they say, hey, we're gonna pull your photos from Google, and then it pops up with a window that looks like this. Right, it's gonna look like that, and this is Google asking you, hey, do you want me to let Walgreens access your photos? And when you say continue, and they tell you Walgreens photo import from Google Photos will be able to view your Google Photos library. Right, so they're going to be able to access all your photos, which they need to be able to print it, right? And so you can either cancel it or continue. This is your opportunity to say, no, I don't want that service doing that thing. And so depending on how refined the question is, it makes a difference as to what you're actually giving them access to. So my question with these things is always like, what exactly does that mean? Because like some sites will say, hey, we're going to give them access to your profile information. Now, if the Social Security Administration said, hey, we're going to give them access to your profile information, I'll be like, hold on, wait a minute. I don't want them accessing my Social Security number. I'm fine with them getting my name, maybe my email, but certainly not my Social Security number. And so you got to be thoughtful about how you grant consent to these things as well. And there's, without contacting the company, there's really no way to know what exactly it is that they're doing. So.
And most of the people will continue
Yeah.
without looking at what access we are providing to that service. And it might be just be to give once, but we just give permissions and then forget about it. And these services will keep permissions for life.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and once you grant them, they're given. It's not like they ask every time. Usually when you grant it, it's just there forever. The authorization server records your response and then it doesn't ask you again. There are probably ways to force a reconsent.
You can go and revoke them.
Yeah, you revoke it. Yep.
Else in what the 2.0 there is expiration. When we send that jar, there's expiration.
Yeah, so that's the token itself. That's different. This is the consent on the user's behalf. The consent is saying this user, regardless of the JWT that we're dealing with right now, is authorizing this service to access my information. And then in the future, you're going to have to give me another JWT. And if I've already authorized, or if you've already consented to this, then I'm not going to bother asking you again. And so the JWT is the thing that has the expiration on it. Consents do not. What's that?
The privacy rules should govern this. Right? As per the privacy rule, yeah, I give the consent just this time. So you should not come back to my service without asking for the consent again.
There's a privacy policy link right there.
Yeah. Yeah,
Privacy policy.
right. Yeah, actually, that's an excellent point. Yeah, see Walgreens photo import, Google Photos privacy policy. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, see,
You're opting into all.
if you want to read it, you're welcome to, right? I think that's the expectations. Like, if you want to know what this is doing, they probably talk about it in that terms of service, terms of use, that this is what we're going to do. But man, those things are long.
Well, you need a
And-
lawyer.
And you need to be a lawyer. That's right. Right. Right.
We all agree.
Every time.
There is
Yeah.
a link to that. Okay, so you may be sharing sensitive info, you can always see or remove access in your Google account.
Yeah.
There's a link right there.
Yeah. So there are ways to remove the access, but nobody does. Right.
Right, nobody. Matt, I point out too, this is a case where you are the resource owner. The
Mm-hmm.
resource is your photos.
That's right.
This is one where OAuth 2 fits.
It does.
Flip
Yeah.
that around in business when you're using it to log in.
Yeah. That's why I use this example.
That's where it doesn't fit.
Yes.
Wouldn't it
Yeah.
be nice if it could just simply say for the next hour, well, you're granting access, then we're good.
Yeah.
That would be,
Those I've seen, and they will allow you to.
at least for the session.
Yeah. And
I think I've seen somewhere that it lets you approve only for 7 days or 40 days.
I don't know how to do that with Azure AD.
I mean,
But-
but I've seen in some of the tools where they let you
Yeah.
approve for a specific number of days. And after that, it will go.
Yep. Okay, I'm going to move on. So this is getting into the more of the details of how OAuth is working under the covers. You have different types of tokens. We're going to talk about how those get formatted and how they get exchanged. But for the most part, those are JWTs or JSON Web Tokens. Yeah, I'll talk about those. They're requested by the client. They're authorized by the user, and they're given for a specific resource that you want access to, which is where the authorization part of it comes in. ID tokens are used in Open ID Connect flows. You can request these. These are intended to be used as information about a user, because OAuth was originally built to be an authorization service. Like it gave you access to things. It didn't really tell anything about the user. OpenID Connect came along and was added to OAuth, and so it's like an extension. It's kind of silly that they call it an extension. It just feels like it should be part of it. But when you request an ID token, it has all the user's information in it that you can use on a client, like inside of a web page, like your SPA application. I'll talk about that here in a bit. But the idea is that it doesn't have any authorization information in it. It's just the user's information. Refresh tokens are used to get new tokens when the access or ID tokens expire. The benefit with a refresh token, at least the way that I understand it, is that you're forcing the client to re-authenticate, kind of. So if in the time frame between when they got their first token and when they used their refresh token to grab another token, the user was removed from the system, it's not going to send a valid response back. Refresh tokens are only used to get new tokens. And the user, it's usually an invisible process. The user doesn't see that happen. It happens behind the scenes. The web page goes out to the authorization server, says, hey, I got a refresh token. My token's about to expire. Can you give me a new one? And then it'll say, yep, here's a new one. But it also checks to make sure that the user is a valid user. So, and then flows and grant types. These are the different ways that the user can interact with the whole system. And we're going to talk about these here in a minute. Yeah. I guess any questions on those terms? Clear as mud, right?
Validating a refresh token is a source file.
Yeah.
So if you fire
one that's existing, yeah. An existing refresh token.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I don't have a whole bunch of experience doing that, but yeah, I can imagine that if the authorization server doesn't handle it properly, then that could be an issue for sure. Yeah, so secrets, I'm going to skip this one. I don't know. And so same thing. Now that you know a little bit more about how it all works, hopefully this slide makes a little bit more sense. You can kind of see how the tokens interact with the client, the resource server, and all that. So we have different flows in OAuth. There's about 4 or 5 different flows depending on what you consider a flow. But the goal there is to minimize the risk of people stealing it and using it, right? So there's or intercepting it, changing it, all those things. Those are concepts that are built into the JWT, the token itself. And the choice of which flow that you use is based on these 3 things. The user presence, is the user available to authenticate and consent? Sometimes you have a daemon application where it's going to be running behind the scenes. You don't actually have a user that's logging in. So how do you deal with that? OAuth talks about that. Browser availability, can you do this from a web browser? A lot of the flows require some redirection in the web browser because you don't want to be typing your password into, or any secret really, into a client application, because then they have your secret and they can just do whatever they want whenever they want, right? Even when you're not logged in. Now for the duration of your token, they're going to be able to get access to whatever resource that they want, but after that token expires, it's done. Whereas if you gave them your password, then they're going to be able to log in as you and do whatever they want during whatever time frame. So you want to make sure that the resource server is the one where you enter your password. And then the client type is also important. So you have public and private, or public and confidential clients. Public clients are clients you can't trust. Clients that can be manipulated, changed, all those things. So this does include like mobile applications, browser applications, maybe desktop applications, depending on how you're using it. And they generally can't be trusted. Confidential clients are things you can trust. This is code that you have under your control. So code that's running on your web server is considered a confidential client. It can keep secrets secret, and so like a web server is good for that, or like a batch processing application. It can keep secrets safe, all that. We're gonna get into this in just a sec. This slide I think is really important. Like when I saw this, it was like light bulbs. This is super helpful. I have this presentation in GitHub, so you'll be able to pull down there if you want. But I would recommend reviewing this one. And I didn't come up with this, as Microsoft has this. So I'd recommend checking it out. But you have these different kinds of flows: client credential, authorization code, implicit flow, on behalf of flow, device code flow, and resource owner password. And so then the questions that you need to ask yourself: is there a user available? Is there a browser available? And what kind of client am I dealing with? And so this matrix will then tell you what type of flow you should use based on the situation that you find yourself in. And so typical scenarios here: client credentials, you'd use those in a back-end service. Authorization code grants, or the more modern approach to that is using Pixie Flow. These two are kind of the same. You can still use an authorization code grant if you have if you're using Blazor, or not Blazor, but Razor pages in .NET would be the way that we would do that. So it's a server rendered HTML. You can that's considered a confidential client, so it has the ability to store secrets. You can use that there, but in mobile apps or SPAs, single page applications, those are not confidential clients. And so what they end up doing, and we'll walk through this here in a little bit, but they'll generate a cryptographic secret on the client, hash it, send it to the server. The server does something with it, sends it back, and is able to verify that the two are the only two that are aware of what's happening. How that works exactly behind the scenes is still somewhat of a mystery to me, but it's safer. There's probably people in here that know how that works. We're going to look at the flow, and you can try to extract it from there. But yeah, implicit flow is what Pixie replaces. So probably shouldn't use implicit flow anymore. So you would have used those in SPAs or mobile applications in the past. Not quite as secure. It exposed some information that it didn't have to, and so they enhanced OAuth with this Pixie flow. On behalf of flows, give you downstream downstream APIs access, so you can start chaining tokens together as you go from API to API to API. So you get a user that logs in, it connects to an API. That API needs to call another API and needs to authenticate to it, but that second API also needs the original user's information. So it will generate a new token, send it over here. It still has all the user's information, but it's specifically for that service. So there's the concept of an audience on a token. The audience is necessary because it tells the receiver of the token that this token was intended for you. And it's one of the validation steps you need to do when you're validating tokens, that you need to validate that the audience is right, that you are the intended service for this. If you're not, then you need to reject it. There's lots of ways that you can mess up pretty easily doing that. I know early on, that was one of the things that I struggled with, knowing that the audience tells the service that you are the intended recipient. Well, why would you want to do that? I mean, obviously I got the token, I'm the intended recipient. Well, not necessarily, because you might have issued that token for the specific service. Somebody might have stole it in between and said, I'm going to use your token to connect to this other thing over here. And that will, if you're validating the audience properly, that will stop that from happening. The on behalf of flow is something is what our demo is focused on. I wasn't able to find any examples on the whole internet on how to do this, so this is the only one in existence. So you guys get to see it first. It's using Microsoft's code, but they don't have any examples for it. Device code flow is like when you when you log into an app on your TV. They'll pop up a code for you and say, hey, go to this web page and type in this code, sign in, and then type in this code, and then that will authorize you to use whatever device, your TV. You might do this with an IoT device as well. An IoT device might send you a text message, and then you got to go to a web page and log in, type in the code, and it automatically authorizes that IoT device to do what you want. So these are less interactive devices. You can't type a password in on a TV. It's not secure because in my case, my kids are watching me, right? It's like, hey, how do I watch all the stuff I'm not supposed to watch? But, yeah. And then the last one, resource owner password, is one that you probably shouldn't use. This is a flow where you type your password into the client, and then the client generates a token based on that. And in the OAuth spec, they basically say this, you shouldn't use it, and in the next version of OAuth, it's going away. And so if you can, there are certain platforms. I know we were working with Snowflake at Kiewit, and this is the only way that they offer you to log into their platform, which is unfortunate. And so we kind of got to break the rules to do it this way, but because you're exposing a password when you really shouldn't be. So, any questions on the flows? I know there's probably some ambiguity in there. Hopefully, I'm going to run through some diagrams here that will hopefully help you understand that. And I'm thinking that I'm going to run over my hour. So, okay. So first one, and these, I got a bunch of different diagrams. Tried to find the best diagrams I could on the internet. And this one, I really like these, but it didn't have them for every flow. So there's some that aren't quite as detailed. But anyway, credentials flow, probably the simplest one you're going to run into. This is the one where you have a confidential client, you don't have a user, and you don't have a browser, right? And so because you have a confidential client, you can store a secret, and you basically just pass that secret to your token endpoint directly. You don't even go to an authorization page, and it gives you a token back, and then you call your client. And so app XYZ makes a token request to the service endpoint. It should say, well, I guess I should have looked at this a little closer. You know, I'm going to find a better one. We'll do this. Microsoft has some good diagrams for this. Identity client. So this is what they call the protocol diagram. You have your web server, and then you have your web API. That's why this one's so simple, because it just has a couple different things. It redirects from the admin user to grant permissions. It's not really a redirect, it's just direct. Yeah, well, and you would do this prior to the application actually logging in. This is where you're granting the consent on behalf of this thing. And so this part is really done before you even request the token. And then your server, and I would say, I don't know, I suppose you could do it this way. It's not the way that I typically do it, where you have built into your web server the ability to grant consent. Yeah. Right, and we'll walk through that. But usually you do this in the portal, those first couple steps there. The real key to this is that you request a token providing a client secret as a credential. And you do that to your token endpoint, and then it returns the token to the web server, and then the web server calls your web API. The web API validates the token and then sends the data back to the web server. So pretty simple, right? This you kind of start to see how easy it is. Does that make sense? If you don't get this one, we're going to struggle with the next ones. Any questions? Okay. So the next one. Oh man. Authorization code flow. And you know, these are really detailed. I think it's too much. I'm gonna stick with Microsoft's. Auth code flow. That's nice. Okay. So you have two things, I guess four things total involved. You got your native application. This would be your web server. You have an authorization endpoint where your user types in the password. You have your token endpoint where your application goes to request the token once the user has given them access, and then you have your web API, which is the thing you're trying to get access to, right? And so same thing here. You're basically asking, do you authorize the application to do this thing? And then the user basically says, yes, I'm going to, I authorize this app, and I'm going to type in my username and password and all that. And then it returns a authorization code, not a token, mind you, to the native application. This requests a bearer token from the token endpoint using the authorization code, the app's client ID, and then it returns that access token and a refresh token to this. And then you call the web API with that access token in the authorization header. It validates the token and then sends the data back to the application. So what this doesn't illustrate super well is that there is a code that gets exchanged between the native application and the web API. And then the web API, is this the right flow? This was the auth code flow, right? Yeah, auth code grant. Well, I'm not doing this justice. You can start to see how this gets really kind of hairy. Yeah, it is. Yeah. Yeah, I'm just looking for the code. It shows the authorization code being returned here. And it provides the code to the token endpoint, and it returns that access token. I suppose, yeah, actually that does make sense now. So the implicit flow is the one that I'm getting confused with. We'll talk about that here in a minute. But basically, you can see that it's giving the application an authorization code that it can use to exchange for a access token that it can then use to call the web API.
And that access token, refresh token.
Yeah. Yeah.
That will automatically happen. And it substitutes back. It says, okay, here's your new access. Add a new refresh.
Yeah.
And that is in the background.
Nothing is automatic,
Yeah.
right?
So it's in your
Oh.
background, but it doesn't ask.
Right. Yes, because your validation on your web API is looking at that expiration date every time you send it and saying, is that still valid? Yes, it is. Give them their data. No, it's not. Send them a 401. You're unauthorized. Then that forces them to use their refresh token to go get another new access token with a new expiration date. Send it back to your resource server, and then it comes back.
A lot of that you'll never see.
Yeah, if you watch the browser flow, the network trace in your browser, you can actually see all of this happening. But it's pretty intense. There's a lot going on. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep.
So the validation is a really interesting step, and it's a place where people will sometimes forget and not realize they need to validate that the token is for their own API.
Right.
So if you have any token, it'll get you in the door there. And
Right. Yes. That was one of the things I ran into early on with this is, you have to validate the token. All for naught if you don't validate the token. And you have to do a good job validating. You got to validate the issuer, the audience, and I mean, those two are going to be the big ones. Obviously the user, you want to make sure it's a user that you're authorizing. Azure AD has the option to authorize guest accounts. If you want to allow guest users, this would be their B2B type of business to business authorization. So like if Kiewit and Farm Credit wanted to start doing business together, we could connect our businesses, our Active Directory instances, and then Kiewit users can log into Farm Credit's resources and back and forth. But those things have to be set up. Yep. Let's see if the next one's any better. Implicit flow. This one's worse. So let's try and walk through this. So the app asks the user whether to link to the service, and the user responds to it. This would be your consent. The app makes an authorization request to the service's authorization endpoint, basically saying log in, and then it's saying, oh, I'm sorry, this is your consent down here. So step number 3, do you want to authorize? Or this is okay. This is your app. This is your API. This is the yeah. This is the authorization page. authorization server, authorization page. So these are basically the same thing here. This authorization server will serve the authorization page, gives you a username and password login. And this is important, like I was saying before, you want to put your username and password here, not up here. And that's really a lot of what OAuth gives us, is the ability to do that, to keep our passwords safe. We display that to the user after they've checked that they want to log in. It sends them back to the authorization server, which then directs them back to their application and gives it a access token, and then the access token can be used to access the resource server. Now, there's a whole bunch of little lines down here where it is bouncing back and forth, and this right here was the step that I was looking for in the auth code flow. But the resource server inquires the authorization server info about the access token. So when the access token is sent to the authorization server in an implicit flow, the resource servers, as part of its validation process, needs to go back to the authorization server and say, hey, I got this access token, is it good? And then the authorization server will say, yes, you're good to go. And then it gives it back to the authorization server, then it serves the resource back to the user. And that's really what sets this one apart, is that you are doing that call from the resource server to the authorization server. And you don't see this, I think, in any other flow.
What makes it look confusing is you have the app up here saying, hey, can I link to the service? And then down here, the app is not saying, hey, can I have that?
Right. Yeah, you got the same thing represented in a couple different places.
That's what makes it more confusing.
Yeah, let's take a look at it here. This one might be easier to see. Yes. Right. And I actually like these. Now that I was reading those last night, and I was like, oh, those are kind of nice. I think I like these better. So you should give a presentation to the user group. There's no pressure here. Like, you don't have to know what you're talking about. That's not true. Yeah, that doesn't mean much. So in this case, your browser redirects the user to log into the browser. They enter their credentials, and then it returns a token for the browser in just a fragment of that. It doesn't have the whole thing. Calls the web API with that token, the authorization header, validates the token, returns the data to the spa. Is this? Hold on. I think I had the wrong one. Nope, that's it. Yeah, so this one is not super thorough either, but hopefully you get the point.
It doesn't show the validation.
It does not show that. Yeah, it just kind of like says, hey, you're going to validate it. Because in this step, it needs to call back to the authorization server to get it, but it's not showing that.
I think that's which.
Yeah.
I think that's because it's abstracted away.
Well, sure, yeah. And when you're using libraries for this, all of this goes away. Like, you don't have to know how any of this works. It just happens, which is really great.
But I think implicit returns both the ID and the access token, and that's kind of why they deprecated it. It was such a security wall.
Yeah. Yeah.
If I remember right, it's been quite a few years.
Yeah.
The key takeaway is to use bridge flowing bridge scenario.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And at the end of the day, I mean, you really don't have to understand this. It's good to understand it. And it's actually kind of interesting. I'm still learning. And yeah.
But implicit should not be used.
Implicit should just not be used,
But
yeah.
I think the confusion happens because you can actually use multiple flows in the same situation. So you have to really.
Right. Yeah, that's right. You could use a client credential flow in any of these situations, right? But you have to put the secret in your client. As soon as you do that, it's not secret anymore, and you can get into big trouble. So yeah, you can totally mess it up. It's super easy to mess it up, and it still works.
You have that slide right where you were showing which flow should be used for.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's the key in my opinion.
Yeah.
I think if you understand which flow has to be used in this situation.
Right. Yeah, and you know, it's just complicated.
It is all rendering in 5%.
Yeah, and so like this one, I think I totally get. Because we're gonna talk about this. This abstracts away a lot too, because this whole like number one is whatever flow you used for first authentication. So it could have been implicit, it could have been authorization code, it could be client credentials, probably not client credentials in this case, but could be, I guess. But that's line number one. And then Web API says, hey, I want to call this Web API B. So then it goes back to the authorization Microsoft Identity Platform, gets the token, and it provides a secret with that. And so you can verify that this is coming from Web API A, but I'm basically passing through the token that the user gave me. I'm just changing the audience so that it is Web API B, so it validates over here. And then it returns that to the Web API A. It uses that to call Web API B, and then returns the data there, which then probably returns more data to the user, which they don't show here, but kind of get the point. Yeah. You know better than to ask me more if I have questions about that. So I'm not going to be able to. All right, and this is the slide that I promised earlier that talks about how all the different components in AD fit together. And this is kind of why Microsoft has decided to rename Active Directory or Azure Active Directory to Entra, because in this whole diagram, this is your AD, Azure AD. That's it. Everything else is something else that's Active Directory related, right? And so they're trying to distinguish it from all this other
I think
noise.
this shows, highlights how you can synchronize your.
Yeah, this is.
Directory with your on-prem.
Yeah, this would be like if you're a network administrator and you need to like connect different domains together, set up forests, and these are all the tools that you would use to do that. Most of this, 90% of this is not Azure Active Directory. And so that's why you see that Microsoft has changed it to Entra ID. All right, so now we're gonna start talking about specifics of, yeah, this question?
That last diagram is confusing.
It should be. I mean, you don't have to understand any of this. I just showed it because the Azure Active Directory part is just this little bitty thing right here. Everything else around it is stuff that, as developers, we don't need to understand.
Okay. So on the top is the cloud components, and on the bottom is on-premises, and how Active Directory gets synchronized to Azure AD, and how authentication can work through application.
Yeah. Yep. See?
That one makes more sense.
Yeah. Get that. So then specifics of Azure Active Directory or Entra ID. So it is a SaaS multi-tenant cloud service. So meaning that Microsoft hosts it exclusively in the cloud. You don't run it on premise. It can have multiple tenants. A tenant is like a company. So Farm Credit will have a tenant. Hewitt will have a tenant. Companies A, B, and C will have their own tenants. And they all live inside of Azure Active Directory together. And they are separate, right? You can't access, like I can't log into Farm Credit's network because I don't have a user there, and vice versa. But they all live together. And a tenant, I say that, but a tenant can contain users from multiple domains. And so this would be the way that you set up B2B kind of situations where you need to connect two companies together. You can set up guest accounts basically that allow users to log in from another domain. So you can set up your Google account to log into AD or your Facebook account or whatever you want. And you can set those up so that you can use those to log into AD, which then gives you access to resources inside of the tenant that you're connecting to. Yeah, and then they're always identified with one of these three ways of doing it. So xyz.onmicrosoft.com, so this would be like Farm Credit or fcsamerica.onmicrosoft.com. There's also a GUID attached to the tenant, and you can use a custom domain as well. Which I'm going to show you all of
As
this.
soon as you create a tenant in a on portal, when you get to the tenant, it automatically gives that on Microsoft.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. You always have the XYZ on Microsoft.com. That's kind of like your fallback. But typically, companies don't want to use that, so they'll use their own custom domain.
And when you say they can gain users from several domains, is it guest users or just things they can do?
I believe the way that works is just guest users. No, again, not an expert, I think, but that's the way that I've used it in the past. One of the core concepts inside of Azure Active Directory are applications, which are they're configured via app registrations. And this gets a little bit like we're going to walk through this, but you have app registrations and you have enterprise apps. We're not going to talk about enterprise apps because that's more to do with the authorization side of AD. App registrations are where you're going to do most of your work. So you configure your token, what kinds of tokens you can issue from an app registration. You can configure your replay or your reply URLs. You can configure your secrets there. Exposed scopes, so these are your permissions that you want to expose in your applications. This would be like user.read, which is a very common Microsoft Graph scope. What those roles are in there, so these would be custom things that a user is allowed to do inside your application. And then visibility from other tenants. So if you want to set up a multi-tenant tenant, app registration, which we're not going to talk about because I'm not qualified. And then it operates on the application entity. So there's a number of different entities in here. I think I have a slide following this. You have an application identity, a service principal are the two main things. Service principals are operated on by enterprise apps. App registrations operate on the application and service principal. For the most part, you don't need to know that. But if you get a little bit deeper into it, you'll need to start understanding how those things apply. Okay. Well, we're almost ready to show you some code. I really came into this thinking I was going to be a super heavy demo presentation, but then I got to thinking about, man, there's so much, like, a lot you need to know. And so I did a terrible job of explaining that. Now we're going to talk about something that I understand. And so I built this application that has these components in it. We have a user interface, and this is a vanilla JS application, right? So it's not React, it's not Angular. I wanted to make it as stupid simple as possible. So I left out all that stuff. It just makes, it pulls down the MSAL libraries into the JavaScript application and then uses them. I have two APIs, API A and API B. These are .NET services, web APIs that you can that the user interface interacts with, and then we have Azure AD that talks to them. And so the very first thing that's going to happen is that the user interface will redirect back over to Azure AD because the user's not logged in. That will redirect them back to the user interface with a token. The token will be used to access API A. API A will then take that token, generate a new token, and use that for API B, and it's going to send that over here, and then it's going to return all the data all the way back to the user interface. So, okay, let's dig into some code. All right, and this is going to be really hard to do on a single screen. When I had this up at home, I had like all three screens going. So here's the code. We have API A, API B, and the UI. And again, the UI consists of basically two files. We have an HTML file and a JavaScript file. So clearly the user interface here is not going to be amazing, right? But this is meant to demonstrate something that I haven't seen anywhere else. So I thought this would be fun to show you guys. There's a sign in, sign out button, and a bunch of details about the user that's going to get. And then the probably one of the more important parts here is can you guys see this? Probably not. Yeah, sorry. Let's do that. Is that better? Okay. And so in order to pull down MSAL into the browser, I used unpack or unpackage to make it act like a regular JavaScript library, JavaScript stuff. right? Don't think that's not the point of this discussion. But this is the way you work with it if you don't have Angular or React or some other modern framework to help you out. JavaScript is
You run this chapter?
I did.
I
Yeah.
like running Java.
I don't. I'm not a JavaScript
I know
fan.
That's why I'm surprised.
And so yeah, I mean, JavaScript runs the world, and it's sad, but it does. But this is not recorded, right? And so we have a link to the MSAL libraries at Microsoft, and we have index.js, which is my file. And so inside of index.js, we have a configuration. So we have this MSAL configuration, which talks about all the different parts of it. I'm going to dig into it here in a little bit. We have a login request, which basically just specifies the scope that I want to access, and this is for user.read on Microsoft Graph. And so scopes end up looking like this. They usually look like an API or a URL. They don't always begin with http://, but this one does, because this is Microsoft's. And so this is the unique way that Microsoft defines scopes for MS Graph. And MS Graph is Microsoft's API that allows you to access everything. Like you can do anything from MS Graph. Like if you want to do it in Microsoft, Graph is your way to do it. You can update app registrations. You can send emails. You can do anything, right? So that's a whole presentation in and of itself. I don't know if you guys have had a presentation on Graph, but that would be a really good one. And then the token request, and this one contains the scope that's specific to my app registration. So you can see it has this GUID in here, and then it has a user impersonation name. This is the name of my scope. This is the app registration that contains that scope. And so then when I make requests using my token, it will include this scope, and then my API can validate that this user is authorized to use this scope. And I'm not doing that because, again, we're not talking about authorization, but that's the way you would begin to do these things. You do need to include at least one scope so that it knows what audience you're trying to connect to, because we're not telling it that anywhere else. And this is the way that it knows that this is the app that I'm trying to connect to. No, I'm going quick, but we'll go back through this and you guys can ask me questions. And so then we have this MSAL.public client application. We pass in the configuration that we saw up here. And then we take that MSAL object, and then when we handle redirect, we go to this handle response, which, yeah, it does this error handling in here too, which is hopefully we won't run into. We'll see. And then the handle response basically just does some checks to make sure you only got one user count back, show the welcome message, and that just fills in all the details on the front end with the details in the tokens, right? And then you'll see everything kind of pop up. Let's see. So then we have the sign-outs. We can do the login redirect for sign-in. Logout request. You have to get a configuration object here to tell it what user that you're logging out, and then you can get the token using a redirect. So there's two different ways. You can either get them silently, or you can use. Actually, there's three. You can get them silently. You can get with a redirect, or you can get with a pop-up. It's your choice, I guess. Silent, I believe, is only useful if you have a refresh token. The redirect and pop-up are ways that you can go about getting a token for the first time. And I guess it'll pick the right thing to do based on what it is that you're trying to do. And so in this case, we are, even though we're calling get token redirect, it's actually first trying to return the token, or acquire the token silently. If it errors, then it's going to go and acquire the token with a redirect. So a little bit of logic that you have to add. This code came from Microsoft, so this is all available online if you want to check it out. When I show you there's like dozens of samples. This is not one because it doesn't exist. And so the thing that I kind of glossed over here at the beginning is this MSAL config object, and this contains all the details about your app registration. And we're going to walk through that here in a second. And I'll come back and we'll go through this again. So your client ID, your authority, which includes your tenant ID, which is this guy right here, and then your redirect URI. So The UI is port 2000, the API-A is 3000, and the API-B is 4000. Those are the ports that we're going to see those running on. You can configure how the cache works, what some logger options are. I didn't really mess with these, but yeah. And so that's the UI. And so then our API-A basically consists of a really simple controller that just makes a call out to our downstream API, and is configured with. It's really hard to do it, and like I've been on the receiving end of this, and I understand like you're probably bouncing all over the place. We're gonna go through it again. I'll do this. Oh man, these things never go slow. Time flies. Yeah. So you have your client ID, which is different than the one we had in our UI. Your domain, what your tenant ID is, and then your instance as well, and then a secret here as well. So this is a specific secret for that API, and then the scopes, and so this is the scope that we're going to request for our downstream API, and then what the URL for that downstream API is. And so this code here is the Microsoft Identity Web NuGet package that you can add to your .NET packages. This is the way you validate your tokens in .NET. So whenever we saw that little loop there at the end when it said validate token, that's what this is doing for you. And you're basically just giving it the details about what do I need to validate. And so the client ID is saying this is how it validates your audience. The token has to be for this audience or for this client ID. The domain is what it's going to use to connect to the endpoints. I don't believe it's needed for this. I think it does work without it, but I'd probably best off setting that. And then actually,
I think it might just work with the tenant.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so it's using the tenant ID instead of the domain. So I don't think this is necessary because this was working without it. So, and then you also have this enable token acquisition to call downstream API, which is a great method name, right? What this does is it adds all the services necessary for this API to call downstream to the second API. So it's actually making HTTP requests to the Azure AD endpoints and filling the token in. This is the on behalf of flow, right? Yeah. So this is one of the more complicated flows in my opinion, because you have the whole like UI part of it, which is doing in this case Pixie, and then it's calling into this first API, which is validating that token, that access token that it got from the UI, and then it's generating another token based on that token to call the secondary web, the API-B, which ultimately has the data that we're looking for, and that's going to like bring it all the way back up through. In order to do that, you need a client secret, and then this. Probably should turn this on in production, but this will help you debug some errors as well. And then for every single downstream API that you have, you call this add downstream API, you give it a name, and then you configure some options, which are the bare minimum or the scopes and the base URL that you're going to call. And then you have to call the add in-memory token caches. So this is what the web server uses to cache your token, so it's not calling the token endpoint over and over and over again. Every single time it gets a request, it's going to store it, and if it's not expired and it's good to go, then it's just going to reuse the same token over again. So it's handling all that behind the scenes for you. And then we have our standard, web API stuff, which we can talk about that if we want. One of the more important parts here is this identity model event source object, which is a static object, and it has this show PII. And if you're going to be debugging problems with these things, you're going to want that because by nature, this is a security framework, and so it will not expose a lot of information about what's happening behind the scenes. So when things break, it doesn't tell you what. But when you turn this show PII on, it will start to tell you exactly what happened and why it failed, which is super helpful. I didn't know about this until just probably 2 or 3 months ago. Changed my life. Yeah. And so then the way that the calls to the downstream happen are in our controller. We have our constructor here. So this is the A constructor, A controller constructor. We inject an I downstream API, and that gets added when we called this enable token acquisition to call downstream APIs. That made this available. And so that allows us to inject this I downstream API. And then on the I downstream API, we have this call API for user async. And we give it the name, which you saw in the configuration. This is the URL that we saw over here, API B. And these are the options. So it already has the base URL for that API. And then we give it another option for the relative path. So in this case, we're calling the B API. And then it's going to give us a response, and then we're going to read that as a string and just return it. So basically, this is just a pass-through API, but I wanted to illustrate how that worked. And then it's the exact same thing, except less complicated in API B. API B has the same kind of configuration in it. In this one, I do have like this. You can actually look at the JWT as it comes in. This is an example of how to do that. If you want to, we can dig into it, but same kind of configuration. This one has different client ID, different tenant, different instance, all that stuff, added controllers. This one does not call a downstream API, so we're missing all that stuff that we saw in the previous one, so like this one's easier. And then the controller in this guy, I'm sorry for those of you that might not know .NET. Hopefully most of you understand this, but I'm kind of like glossing over a bunch of details. All this does is returns a string, and then it basically takes the user that's logged in and pulls the claims off of that, finds one that has the name value on it, and sets the value, and then close that, and then also returns their email address. The email address is stored in this. It's silly. These things are named funny, but this value contains the email address. This one contains the actual name.
That's, I think, because in Azure AD, you stores email address and UPN.
Right. Yeah. You'd think, though, that it would call it the UPN then. Right? I don't know.
Yeah, but
These are the things you discover when you're
hacking
hacking stuff.
stuff.
Right. Names.
Names can be misleading.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't usually call it an email address a name. But anyway, that's the way it works. So that's what you got to do. Yeah. Would anybody like me to go back and look at anything here? Did I just breeze over anything that was super confusing? We're gonna run it here in a second, and then yeah.
I can't remember what it's called, but so the ability to hook into that allows you to kind of get a chance to bring that.
Oh, when you make the second API call?
Just kind of like say you're saying the email address.
Oh, yeah.
It kind of allows you to intercept that.
Yes. Yeah, you can intercept the claims. I think it probably is something similar to this. I haven't done that. That's interesting. I didn't know specifically that you could do that, but you can do things with its JWT option events. So like on token validated, we get access to all the details of the token after it's been validated. You can also, there's an event for on failed here. I don't know if code. I don't usually program in code because in .NET it's not easy. It's not made for it.
Yeah.
Okay. So you can fix the fact that Microsoft named it name and rename it email. Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. Oops. Anything else that you guys want me to go look at before we run it? Okay. I don't mind going back. It's on GitHub. Yes. I will share the link at the end. Let's see. Okay, this is where it gets a little bit interesting because I'm going to have to open a bunch of little windows down here. So we're going to open that one and then that one. Okay, so we have the UI over here. The one on the left is the UI. The one in the middle is the API A. And this one is the API B. Okay, and so then I have a file in here called start.bat. It just runs a little HTTP server and then over here I can do a .NET build. While we're waiting for that, I'll do another one here. .NET build, and then I can do a run. That will run my API. This is where things break. Okay, so then if we go to localhost port 2000, this is my UI. We have our web page pops up. We have sign in, sign out buttons at the top. Nothing's filled in because we don't have those details yet. When you click sign in, it'll redirect me over to this is Azure AD, showing me this page. So again, I've logged in before. Let's do it this way so we can actually see it happening. Sign in. So this is an incognito tab, so it doesn't have all the cookies and whatnot are not set. So I can do, let's see, I want to use this one, Matt at Omaha.dev. And then password. So again, this is login.microsoft.com. I'm entering my password here, which is important. They're the only ones that have access to it, and they're going to ask me, do you want to stay signed in? So yes. And then this data here all comes from the ID or the ID token that was brought back. So it has the name, the username. Again, username is email, and this is my object ID in Azure Active Directory. The tenant ID, this is by issuer, so you can kind of see. So we have A470 here. My issuer is that same thing, A47078. You can see that I have a ID token and an access token was returned. One thing you can do with these guys. We haven't talked about it. We're probably going to have to gloss over this too. But you can go to, let's do jwt.ms is a really great resource for this. So if you have these tokens and you want to know what's in them, you can just come to this website, or jwt.io is another good one. Paste it in there, and then it will tell you what's in that token at the bottom. And what makes this one particularly good is that it will tell you what it means. If you click on the claims. And so each one of the claims comes through, and you can see that the AUD claim with this value, this identifies the intended recipient. So this is the audience, which I was saying before is super important that you need to validate. So it validates your audience and your apps, your application ID assigned your app in Azure portal. You should validate this value and reject the token if the value doesn't match, right? And so you can kind of look through each one of these, understand what each one means. There's some in here that are like this UTI, internal claim used by Azure to revalidate tokens, should be ignored. Like, don't touch that one. And so on and so forth. But so this one this is our access token, I believe is the one I copied. Oh no, that's the ID token. The access token has a little bit more in it. What you won't see over here are any scopes. I think there's no SCP claim in this, but if I take my access token and put it in here, we'll see my my SCP claim, and that's user impersonation. This is basically saying, what roles do I have within your application? What can I do? This would be like read your photos in the Walgreens application, right? Or Google would have read your photos, and then Walgreens would ask for that, and then you would consent. And that's what this is doing. I did an admin consent earlier, which is why I didn't have to authorize it. But if I hadn't done that.
It's expired in 60.
What's that?
What's the expiry? Is it 60 minutes?
I think it's 60 minutes by default. Yeah, I think there are ways to adjust that, but for the most part, you really shouldn't need to. I don't know what the max is, but
Then it doesn't show anything expired.
yeah, for the most part, you probably shouldn't need to change the expiration, because you can always use a refresh token to go get a new token if you need it. Yeah.
Middleware, it's called like one of the options is SKU time. And so it actually adds on another 5 minutes of validation just within your application.
Oh.
That's something that.
So like when it expires, basically from the time it expires, so that time is when you had to refresh it.
Well, yeah, I guess like your application would technically still view that token as valid, even though maybe it expired 3 minutes ago.
Just due to clock skew.
Yeah,
Probably.
It's just like a
Yeah.
default in .NET, you know, it never changes because I guess it's a public.
Right.
Rely on it outside of it.
Okay.
So,
That's interesting.
it's important.
Yeah, didn't know that. Cool.
What's interesting on here is you have your audience claim and your app ID claim. And that's what you can validate to make sure the token is from the client you expect it's from, and the audience is your API, so it's a token meant for you.
Right.
For your
Yeah.
API.
For the most part, yeah, your audience, this value here should match this one. You can change these. This can be changed to whatever you want it to be. But for the most part, I don't know why you would. I suppose if you had like some really public API that you wanted to have a lot of control over and people might be looking at it, you might want to change it to something a little bit more reasonable, but I never change it.
One is your client, and one is your API.
That's right. Yes, that's a good point. Yes, thank you for bringing that up, Matt. Mike. Yeah, this is the ID for the API that I'm calling, and this is the ID for my client. Right. So there's it, and you can do this a lot of different ways. Like we do this wrong at Kiwit a lot. We'll use the same app registration for both the UI and for the API. If you have full control over everything involved, that's probably not a huge deal. But in situations where it's going to be more public, you definitely don't want to do that. And this one's done correctly, and we will probably start doing them more correctly there. But yeah. The other important one is this issuer. You want to make sure that this is right. If you don't have the issuer correct, then anybody could issue a token, and it would be okay. That's not okay. And then yeah, we'll gloss over that. Any questions about this here? Yeah, so this is like if we, like I'll open up the debug window here real quick, and we'll just refresh this really fast. And you can see it calls my API. Oh, is this the? Yeah, I don't want the pre-flight cores. And so in here, so this is the call to the API. It contains this token, right? So in the authorization header, we have this bearer, and then we have the token. And if I were to take this token and put it into my gwt.ms, it's effectively the same thing, right? So that's how the API gets access to the token, is via this authorization header. And then you can see that you might have noticed when we first pulled this up that this came through a little bit delayed. And so that's because I had to call the first API, which then called the second API, and they were both cold starting at that point, and so they're a little bit slow. But now, this thing's gonna come right back. But it goes through all of those. This is where like having two screens would be handy. Let's see, that and that. So you should be able to see, like, this is again the UI here, API A, API B. If I, yes.
Click on the,
I don't use code enough.
you click on the icon.
Oh, yeah, there you go, thank you. So if I refresh this, it's gonna go super fast. As you can see, like, if you're really sharp, you could see it hit this one, then this one, then this one. And if you're really fast, you would actually see another, when this call finished, this is gonna give you a little bit more data and come back. Pretty cool. Yeah, so, what was I? I'm sure I've talked about all this stuff. Oh yeah, we haven't even looked at Azure AD yet. Let's, what's that? Yeah, right, yes, yes, and yeah, if we go back to the, oops. Did I close Visual Studio Code? Oh my gosh, why did I do that? All right. You should stop me, Mike. Yeah, so if we go back to API B, and yeah, so I want the controller though. Yeah, so the name that comes in Office user. Again, this is the API that's being logged into from the other API. And that API didn't know, I mean, it didn't generate it didn't have a user log in, right? It just had the token from the user that logged in. It generated another token and was able to log in there. And that's the username that we see right here. That was your question, right?
Yes, I guess a communication token that sends.
Mm-hmm.
It's different than that.
It is, yeah.
So it goes that user information as well.
Yeah, actually, it's pretty interesting what ends up happening to that token. Well, on my, I know. Yeah, if you guys gotta leave, I don't mind. Like if you get up and go, I'll wrap this up. I'm sorry. I thought I was gonna be able to do this quick.
I didn't realize mine.
This, yeah, I'm sorry. That's this one here. This claim is really the only one that's different. This app ID ACR. In the first one, it was a 1, meaning that this user is logged into interactively by user, and 0 indicates that it was logged into with a secret. And that's all that's different between those two tokens. There's a few things like maybe some of these internal things. This UTI I think was different as well, but those are all internal things. But.
Microsoft specific implementation to be able to do this or
Yeah. If you look at the public spec, there's no such thing as an on behalf of flow that I can find. It seems like it's a Microsoft thing, but it's pretty valuable in my opinion. Like being able to call an API from an API and passing through the original user's information. Yeah, pretty helpful. I got to show you Azure AD, right? So we can log into the portal, and I'm going to log in with my Omaha.dev account. And I was going to go through and create these for you and show you what the process looked like. I underestimated how much time that was going to take. We have Azure AD, Azure Active Directory here, app registrations on the node here, or the blade, and then I have 3 different app registrations in here. The UI, the API A, and API B. The UI has this client ID, and so that's the client ID that we put into the msal config in there. It has the tenant ID that we talked about, and then it also has a scope defined on the API permissions. So it has this user impersonation scope that I put in there. If we click on this, you can see the details about it, and you can say admin consent required. But then what I did here is I clicked this grant admin consent for omaha.dev, and this just grants it for everybody in my whole domain. And then that way no users are ever asked to log in or to consent. Right, yeah, and you can only do that as a global administrator. So like within your org, you're probably, like if you're me, you don't have access to global admin, nor would I ever want it. Like, it's plausible deniability, right? When things break.
The recommendation is there will be only 3 global administrators.
Yeah,
Because the admin owns the resource owners, they can consent.
that's right.
But this is where it wouldn't make sense if, say, Walgreens consented for you
Mhm.
to see your photos on Google, because then you would.
Well, it would have to be Google consenting
Yeah,
for me, right?
Right, yeah.
In that case,
Thank you, but that's where it doesn't make sense when you actually do own the resource.
right?
So.
Yeah. We just always click this button within an organization. You're probably just always going to click this button because you have control over your users. It is, yes. And so we have this scope defined here, exposing an API. And for the UI, we're not exposing an API, so there's nothing to do here. This is where you define your new scopes. Actually, API permission is where you're basically giving it access to other APIs. So you can see this is for the FB in this case meant fallback. This is what I was going to use in case it all failed, but this, I guess it kind of did. But the user impersonation is a scope on that API. So if we, and that's really all there is on this on the UI. If we go over to the API A, you'll see that on the expose an API tab, we have a scope here, and this is the user impersonation scope. And then you can start to define who can consent to this. In this case, I said only admins can consent. If I wanted users to be able to consent, I could click this as well. Inside of a business, you're probably only going to want admins. And then permissions. So in this case, I want my API A to be able to call my API B, right? And so that's what this permission here gives me access to. It also has access to the graph user.read, which gets added for you by default. And then I believe, yeah. And then if we, the other thing on this API A is that we have a secret defined. This is how we're able to do the on behalf of flow. And then, what's that? For on behalf of flow, you need a secret. You can also use it for client credentials as well. Yep. So on behalf of flow sort of is like a hybrid between one of the regular flows and client credentials. And then the API B, again, this one's pretty simple. It only exposes a permission. And then this is kind of interesting here. You can add a client application. If you do this, then that basically says anybody calling from this client application doesn't have to consent. Basically doing it for you.
That's the ID for your API.
Yes, it is. Yes, this is the API A is 742B, right? So if I come back over here to API A 742B, right? Yeah. I'm over. I wish I could go through a little bit more of this with you. I was going to go walk through the whole thing and get it for you, but that pretty much covers the stuff that I really wanted to get through. There's also some other things like B2B and B2C. B2C would be a whole presentation in and of itself. It's kind of cool. You can set up your own provider for your application. So if you wanted to become your own Facebook and you want to use Microsoft's backend, they would build their own. But if you want to have clients log into your application, like users that aren't a part of your company, you'd use the B2C setup. And then authorization, again, is another component that's probably even bigger than all of this that you should look into. Enterprise applications inside of Azure AD will allow you to grant authorization to users. We can talk about that for a bit too. And then SSO, enterprise apps, allow you to define how you can log into external applications as well. So like if you like GitHub. If you want to connect your AD instance to GitHub and have users sign into GitHub with your AD accounts, you can do that with a enterprise application using SSL. So, any questions? Okay. I'm sorry I went over. I hope you enjoyed it. I didn't mean for it to go so long, but yeah, thanks. Is that it?
Thanks, Matt. I mean, this is such a vast topic. I know you can have it out of a workshop.
Yeah, well, yeah, I went to 3 days worth of training. I think I condensed about a day in this time. I tried to.
But I really appreciate it. This is such a vast topic and condensing it into an hour. It's hard, but it was good.
Yeah.
So yeah, with that, thank you, Matt.
It's my pleasure. We'll see if I can do some more.
And we are always looking for speakers for the upcoming meeting. So if you are interested, please reach out to me. You don't have to have any past experience. You can just talk about whatever great things you're doing and answer whatever you're doing. Yeah, that's pretty much. So we will be meeting next month in September. If you ask also, I will be coordinating meetings. If you want to interest, you let me know. Enjoy the last few, I think, weeks or so.
Sounds good. If you guys have questions, want to chat afterwards, I'll stick around.
So do share the GitHub repo.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
PowerPoint.
Yeah, let's do.
I did record it on Teams. I know it might be heavy.
Yeah, so.
You can always catch what I'm at.
Yeah, I'm pretty easy to find. If you want to send me an email or whatever, hit me up on Slack. I hang out on Azure, the Azure user group, Slack channel, and the .NET user group. So send me an email. Yeah, this is the GitHub repo if you wanted to hang out.
If you can maybe text me
Mm-hmm.
this when I'm uploading the recording on video, I can put the link.
Okay, I will.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, guys.